Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this space of the IPA webinar. As you might know, this is part of a long-term project organized by the website editorial committee. Our aim is to contribute to the development and transmission of some central topics of psychoanalytic theory, as well as to include interdisciplinary contributions on related topics. The IPA worldwide structure enables us to have this open dialogue and to share our ideas around the world. Well, the title of today's webinar is PECs Project, Meeting of Societies on Education, from oversight to collegial quality enhancement. We'll have the possibility to hear and to discuss with the panelists important changes on how on the current criteria of how can IPA contribute to enhance the quality of psychoanalytic training. I'd like to give you a little bit of background about the PECs. It was created as an alternative to another previous IPA committee on education and oversight. That previous committee was devoted to informing, helping, guiding component societies in the organization of their training programs. And it was also concerned to helping to cope with organizational problems. We have to say that its approach was somewhat hierarchical and centralistic. In contrast, the PEC, as you will see, have made important changes on some of these goals, and I would say fundamentally on its methodologies. The emphasis is no longer on central supervision. On the contrary, the PEC promotes an active process of self-reflection on the characteristics and on the difference of our training programs. Group interchange of experiences between peer society has become a central tool. It is expected that they might enhance cooperative horizontal links that thereby lead us to a better consideration, to a better analysis of the differences between ongoing training programs. Well, we are ready to begin, but I would like to explain to you very briefly before passing over to the panelists how we are going to work. The webinar has two sections. In the first part, we'll hear the introductions by the panelists. And the second part is a question and answer slow, devoted to an open dialogue between all of you, the panelists and the attendees. You might send your questions during the whole webinar from the very beginning, but remember they are going to be answered only after the panelist presentations. Look at the right side of your screen. Inside the control panel, you'll find a box entitled questions. You have to type and send the questions on that place. And also, you can download the panelist presentations. Look at in the same control panel, another box called handouts. You simply have to click on the name of the handout you want to download, and it would appear on your computer, on your screen. Well, now we are ready to begin. A last comment. This is an open debate. All the opinions that are going to be discussed are personal responsibility of all of us, panelists and attendees. Well, firstly, we'll hear Dr. Angelica Stahl. Oh, forgive me, Angelica, if I pronounce your name incorrectly, I don't know. But before we hand over to her, I'd like to read a very brief resume of some of her professional activities. Angelica is a fully qualified psychologist. She's also a training analyst for child, adolescent, and adult psychoanalysis for the German Association of Psychoanalysis and the IPA, and for Group Analysis London. For many years, she was a member of the executive board and a director of training for adult and child analysis in the German Association, DVP. She's the member and former chair of the EPF Forum for Child Analysis. Currently, she's the chair of the IPA Psychoanalytic Education Committee. Well, Angelica, it's your turn. Are you ready? Yes.
So thank you very much for inviting me to speak and to tell something about our work, about the Psychoanalytic Educations Committee's work. So our committee belongs to the group of the development committees. So the IPA has 4 macro area of committees, that is administration and governance, scientific development, and that is new IPA in the community, which was created by Virginia Ungar and Sergio Nick. And in this committee, psychoanalysis in the community, there is also an education committee, and that is why our name was changed in Psychoanalytic Education Committee. And as Ines already told you, so I don't have to repeat, our mandate has changed, but I want to tell you something about our mandate. So the mandate is first to facilitate and improve the exchange of ideas and experiences of education and training among all IPA institutes and societies. And second, to promote process of reflection and self-study related to essential processes of education and training, both within and between society. And that's new. It's no more oversight in a hierarchical way where you control rules, but it's to promote a process. And third, what we did before is to provide advice and consultation on request to IPA constituent organization. But our committee has no executive power, but a consultative function for the executive committee and the board of IPA. So we can make no decisions, we just consult. And the PEC does fulfill its mandate with a team of 7 members, 2 from each IPA region, North America, South America, and Europe, the chair and a consultant. I'm the chair of this committee. The members do not represent their individual societies. That's important because some people think we represent our own society, which is not the case. We are meant to bring our expertise in psychoanalytic education and our experiences in training processes resulting from different socio-cultural and historical background of our society, and think very important. Now, the recent re-emergence of very heated debates on frequency after the decision 3-5 in Buenos Aires, you all remember, is, as I understand it, or represents both a disagreement about standard, you know, the basic question, what is psychoanalysis and what is not psychoanalysis? which is a kind of shibboleth. And what is important too, a lack of trust in IPA that is only partially related to standards. I want to stress that it is important for any association to know which standards are universally agreed in IPA and which are not, since the decision by any society to associate means giving up some autonomy and gain the benefits of being a member of a larger group. But there is always a conflicting tension, and this tension between a centralist attitude with the aim of standardizing psychoanalytic training and a decentralized approach that gives individual societies more room for maneuvers and allows greater flexibility, has accompanied psychoanalytic training since the founding of the IPA from the very first moment. Only in 2005, at the IPA Congress in Rio de Janeiro, the IPA acknowledged officially that there were three major training models in its ranks, namely the Italian, the French, and the Uruguayan. In this way, it was possible to officially admit the existence of the French model, which at this point had already been in effect for 40 years. Like any political solution, and this was a political solution, it reflected a possible agreement between the parties in dispute. There was a very big dispute about frequency. But the diversity of the institution with their different tradition still existed. The recognition of the three models was nevertheless a big creative step in the IPA, opening up the discussion and thinking about different ways that psychoanalytic cultures pass on psychoanalytic knowledge. We at PEC think that containing the differences between all IPA societies in the different regions is central to our mandate. As we know, the container is not a thing, but a process of doing psychological work on our disturbing thoughts on differences and negative projections. And that was very much activated and realized after the 3 to 5 decision. So our work is therefore not covering up differences. Rather, we would regard diversity as a source of inspiration, which would assist in contributing to a dialogue, accepting conflicting viewpoints in a collegial and respectful manner. I give this introduction because I think what IPA can do is to help societies to put work in to organize and represent their model of training and to reflect on how they view the development of a competent psychoanalyst. PEC's aim is to further self-reflection of institutes and societies and thereby enhance educational issues such as seminars, supervisions, individual psychoanalysis, progression and graduation, etc. And as well outreach to community, connection with university, continued education of graduates, and attention to the impaired analyst, which is important, and so on. That is, a comprehensive self-study provides a society with an opportunity to describe and reflect on its mission, its philosophy, its orientation to the rest of the IPA psychoanalytic world and to the local community, and to see if its programs and policies and procedures are directed towards their mission. If this self-study is only looked at by the members of a society, it runs all the risk of what is called groupsync, which means a kind of compliance of thinking that does not value critical thinking as it would represent a threat to the safety or stability of the group. So finding a third that is an outside perspective is very useful. In our understanding, the function of a third is exerted in a first step, writing down in a paper what is one doing for all to see it, and that has a regulatory function in itself. And in a second step, it is done by reviewing and discussing in a meeting with peer society the own training, how it is done, and evaluate it. That is on a horizontal level. Following these lines of thought and in agreement with the proposal of the Task Force for Collegial Quality Enhancement of Training, the Psychoanalytic Education Committee developed tools for self-study and self-reflection on education for IPA society. And these self-studies and self-reflections will be shared with other peer society in a group setting during already existing format of regional conferences. I think it's very important that we share it on a group setting, and my colleague Richard Frisch will deepen this aspect. And the other important thing is that we use existing formats of regional conferences. We use existing venues of conferences in the EPR regions because we want to reduce cost for IPA and as well for the participating members of the societies. So in this group, where 3 societies will meet during a regional conference, that could be EBSA, EPF, or FIPAL, they exchange and discuss and evaluate their own training. And each society will participate with 4 to 5 members, the director of training, training analyst or membre titulaire, as it's called in the French model, non-training analyst member, chair of the candidate's faculty. The group discussion will be moderated by a member of PEC, and a PEC member will be an observer, and PEC will provide a toolbox for these meetings of societies. These interchanges will allow local institutes to see the value of IPA membership. I think it has a cohesive function, and to generate new ideas on psychoanalytic education around the IPA regions. These exchanges will help us all better to know and value historically and culturally developed differences. In these ways, we can build bridges between different approaches to training, and we will learn from each other. I think this is the best the IPA can do, as it has the authority. But little means in manpower and money to exert real control over the rules. We can't send oversight committees to societies around the EPI regions. Here, I want to introduce a differentiation between external authority, which is responsible for giving a frame and rules for the analytic training, and an inner authority who is about what the individual and the group in psychoanalytic institutes have internalized of the psychoanalytic method and made its own. That's very important. Michael Parson made this differentiation by referring to the Winnicottian true and false self and the process of subjectivation in the French psychoanalysis. The external authority, one could say, is reminding the societies that they have signed a consensus standard document as being part of the IPA with rights and with responsibilities. That is about keeping rules. But this external authority must be on the basis of internal authority, which means an identification with the analytic function and method, and which is open to critical and independent thinking. In my view, personal encounters between peer societies exchanging ideas about their training, we have a good chance to enhance this. Important is not only to be a good standard keeper, but to create an institutional climate that functions as a good enough container for the transmission of psychoanalysis to the next generation of psychoanalysts. And I think that's extremely important. The psychoanalytic institution can't survive if we can't motivate young people to decide for a psychoanalytic training. So every training system is an ongoing work in process. The main components of training must be periodically rethought, reviewed, and either transformed or reconfirmed. I want to highlight here that the model is a prototype. It's always an ideal guideline and should be seen as such. This can be done best in a peer-reviewing group of societies functioning to each other as a third. In this setting, the inherent uncertainties of our field can be contained and the society supported in dealing with the never-ending process of analytic training. Thank you for listening.
Angelica, for your thought-provoking analysis. You have described in depth PEP's fundamental goals and methodologies. Thank you very much. Now is the turn of our second panelist, Dr. Alfredo Ortiz Fragola. Before handing over to him, I'll tell you very briefly about some of his related scientific activities. Alfredo is a medical doctor, training and supervising analyst at the Buenos Aires Psychoanalytic Association, chair of the Master in Psychopathology and Mental Health program, which is part of Buenos Aires Psychoanalytic Association, member of the IPA Psychoanalytic Education Committee. He was chair of the mental health department at the Clínicas Hospital, which is linked to the University of Buenos Aires, and was professor of psychiatry at the University of Buenos Aires. Well, Alfredo, it's over to you.
Thank you, Ines. I'm happy to be here with my colleagues from the Psychoanalytic Education Committee in order to tell you some ideas of our work. I would like to start these comments with some remarks about the states of crisis and institutional tension and the processes of self-reflection. Tension between different opinion groups on relevant aspects of psychoanalytic training, as well as organizational changes in institutions such as the IPA, result in turbulences and discomfort. As in our own personal life, changes usually produce some kind of tension, which, if it remains persistent and incisive, generates crisis. It is interesting to pause for a moment on the etymology of the term crisis. It comes from the Greek crisis with K, and this in turn from krinein, which means to discern. It belonged to the legal vocabulary, the moment when the judge must discern. So the moment of the sentence. So in the crisis, a future path is defined. Later, the Greek medicine appropriated the term, and so for them, crisis was a condition of the disorder. For example, in some infections, high fever and profuse sweating is the moment when we feel worst, but also, and this is important for us, a factor in the resolution of the disease. That is, our crisis, even our organizational crisis, can include a healthy element of favorable outcome in the future. Of course, this only happens as long as we are capable and sensible to take creative advantage of the turbulence of institutional life and growth. However, it would be naive to think that the subject is simple. 6 years ago, Harriet Wolff, the president-elect of the IPA, was referring to a non-accidental irony of our time about the challenge presented to us by change. She said that change is the very thing we aim to accomplish through our clinical method, and we seek to teach our candidates how to achieve change with their patients. Yet, organizational change is a thing that challenges us as educators in unconscious as well as conscious ways, and often leads to issues of power and authority taking precedence over clinical and educational common sense. Power and authority over clinical and educational common sense. In times of crisis, research might seem a low priority, but as with all crises, it is essential that we monitor innovations and collect high-quality data so that at a later date, we can learn what worked and what did not. This is one of the reasons why in the Psychoanalytic Education Committee for the last few years, we have focused on collecting information on the analytic training. Through the listserv with the directors of training around the world, and especially in the pilot project meetings of societies on education. We could say that psychoanalysis has survived the Second World War. Psychoanalysis has survived deep crises that have affected many countries in which it is inserted, like my own. Last year, psychoanalysis has been served in the pandemic. Moreover, it has shown to be a useful tool to be applied in the community, and it has helped also to think about the problems of mental health and childhood in these months of pain and uncertainty. But psychoanalysis must also be prepared to overcome the difficulties that arise in the evolution of our professional practice. Just as it spreads in a promising way in places where it was not practiced, conquering new territories, it is convenient to listen to the noises that resonate within our own organizations. The voices, as Angelica said, that are heard in our corridors. And last but not least, the concerns expressed by new generations of analysts, by the candidates. Many authors in different latitudes, Stefano Bolognini among them, have highlighted how, despite individual analysis, both problems related to Oedipal rivalry and narcissistic susceptibility have always been recurrent and lacerating in analytic training institutes. I would say that, as with the coronavirus, no one is exempt from being infected, and the damage can be subtle but corrosive. Our proposal from the Education Committee on the IPA, and in accordance with the Task Force on Collegial Quality Enhancement, is to place a strong emphasis on self-reflection inside and in between the institutes to face this challenge. We believe that this will allow us to emerge stronger. So what about self-reflection? Self-reflection plays a key role in healthy human development. This kind of introspection is opposite to rumination. Rumination to make a mental roll, which include pointless brooding, self-criticism, and negative emotions. Both kinds of thinking about ourselves and also about our own training institutes, self-reflection and rumination, may look similar, but the distinction is powerful. I am emphasizing this because rumination can also be related to the problems raised by oversight. Among them is the emergence of despair and resentment, as well as the generation of a climate in some organizations that can inadvertently interfere with innovation and creativity, as well as obstruct the need for some flexibility to face the challenges that arise for the practice of psychoanalysis, and of course, as well as for the training. In contrast, self-reflection points to a process of healthy growth and development of the implicit potential in a thriving and free society. Self-reflection exists inside and in between the societies. Ultimately, self-reflection is also a good part of what we intend to stimulate in our patients and somewhat what is intended in a didactic analysis. Through the pilot project Meeting of Society for Education, we began to see how intensive and refined interactions with other societies facilitates the use of the experiences of others, as well as the development and discovery of one's own perspective. That's a madurational experience that Gabbard and Ogden have highlighted in understanding the process of becoming a psychoanalyst. That's the reason why the pilot experience Meeting of Societies was launched in the 3 geographical areas of the IPA. At the Meeting of Training Institutes of the Latin American Federation of Psychoanalysis, FIPAL, at the end of last year, I told my colleagues that we have a challenge: how to train in the sense of facilitating the development of talent, how to transmit the Freudian legacy and what was developed through more than 100 years of our discipline, and at the same time avoid deforming, avoid that damage to the spontaneity that it is produced when with clinging to the theories or idealized figures that are generated in our societal fields. How to take advantage of the path designed by those who put their imagination and intellect at the service of psychoanalysis. How to help analysts to discover it, take advantage of it, select what is valuable to each one, nurture it, digest it, and discard it. And they do not suffer intoxications. We all know that the journey of several years through a psychoanalytic training institution is usually a transformative experience that generates enthusiasm, satisfaction, and at times also concern and conflict. If there is no conflict, it is because there is something frozen, opaque, or repressed in the oldest member of the institute, in the youngest, in the communication between the two, or within the institution as a whole. We believe that analysts and institutions that shelter us can get a lot out of collegiality, as long as that implies advice and help to colleagues in their professional duties, respect for the ideas of others, and conduct of one's professional life without prejudice toward others. Finally, I want to tell you that just a few days ago, at the beginning of this month, we held the 2nd meeting of societies during the Congress of the Latin American Federation. There were 3 societies from Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay. The first round had taken place last February during the American Psychoanalytic Association Congress with 3 societies and from North America. I had the opportunity to be present in these first 2 meetings in New York as an observer with Marie-France Dispo, and Richard, I think perhaps will make some comments about that meeting, and in Montevideo online as moderator with Ana Rosa Trachtenberg. And it has been stimulating to observe that in all cases, our colleagues from different cultures, but with a clear analytic identity, have participated with generosity, frankness, and spirit of collaboration, without conditions or demands, with freedom of thought, without fear, listening and expressing their own voice. Furthermore, the evidence gathered so far show us that the experience of a horizontal dialogue with colleagues from other societies dedicated to training and also with candidates is particularly beneficial to improve and develop their personal and institutional tasks, as well as to face manifest and unconscious obstacles. In other words, a helpful way to build bridges in psychoanalytic education. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. You have clearly underlined the central role of intra and inter-institutional collegial self-reflection for the evaluation and development of our training models. Thank you. Now I'd like to say a few words about Dr. Richard Frisch, who is our next panelist. Richard is a PhD supervising and training analyst and former director of training of the Washington-Baltimore Psychoanalytic Institute. He is the chair of the Training and Education section of APSA Department of Psychoanalytic Education and serves on the IPA Psychoanalytic Education Committee. And the Task Force on Remote Analysis. He's Associate Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at the George Washington University School of Medicine and has a private practice of psychoanalysis and clinical psychology in Washington, D.C. Well, Richard, it's over to you now.
Thank you so much, Ines, and I really appreciate being here and look forward to the discussion with our colleagues about these important issues. I'm going to talk today a little bit about intergroup encounters as a way to resolve organizational differences, or as an attempt to do that, let's just say, aspirational. And many of you know the Tavistock Institute has provided invaluable knowledge about the nature of group dynamics, including, most relevant for today, intergroup events. Intergroup events, you know, they're organized around small group, large group, and intergroup. And today we're going to talk about intergroup. I will introduce some of the ideas on why Meetings of Society for Education has the potential for dealing with organizational differences, especially around training, that other forums cannot, and some of the potential benefits and limitations that are inherent in such an approach. I borrowed from a monograph from what's called the Grubb Institute in London, in Great Britain, an article written by Palmer and Reed for some of these ideas of the talk. It's been a while since I've studied group dynamics, mostly as a graduate student. This was a very useful monograph to read, to remind me of what I had known before. But I expect there are webinar participants who are more expert than I am at understanding group dynamics, and I hope they will elaborate this from this basic understanding I'm going to provide this morning, today. I will then review some of the results of the first pilot meeting of the Societies on Education held in New York City in February 2020. Now, I looked at my copy, it says 2019, and that was a slip because it was 2020, but it seems so long ago that we met, and the world has changed so much since then. It felt like more than a few months ago. So we all experienced that, I'm thinking, where has the world we knew gone? So we'll talk about what went well, what we learned, what else may be needed to fully articulate and actualize the potential for such encounters to effect a change at the level of the organization. And your thoughts here are especially welcome. Meeting of Societies on Education is an intergroup event, as participants come from different subsystems of the IPA. Representatives from 3 societies meet to discuss their training philosophies and the pleasures, positive results, and problems that they experience in their local groups. They bring with them their identifications and, of course, their conflicts, as Alfredo has mentioned, with their home organizations. Those that attend are representatives of different subgroups of the societies, a leader like the president or the training director, senior faculty, and a candidate. So you can imagine each of these members has a different relation to the home group, as well as different relationships to each other. They join colleagues from other societies and the PEC representatives that are charged with facilitating the experience. And so this is quite a complex encounter when one drills down a little bit into it. Alfredo wrote about the crisis in IPA. There's been increasing conflict over training models, and Angelica mentioned this as well, conflict over training models and adherence to or deviation from classical models by region and local institutes. Accompanying these differences have been concerns about the quality of education and the integrity of training. The Meeting of Societies on Education was created to provide an alternative to oversight. The work task of the Meetings of Societies on Education intergroup event is straightforward, and those of you who know Tavistock will understand work task is a part of that language. The new group, that is the work group, forms for the task of exchanging information about psychoanalytic training and listening and engaging with other institutes around the history, rationale, and success or failures related to their approach to educating candidates. The subtext, which is also made explicit, is this exchange is to broaden and deepen the appreciation for similarities and differences within the larger organization, so that each society can reflect on its own set of policies, procedures, and philosophies, and have a greater appreciation for other ways of educating candidates. I quote briefly from Parker and Reed, quote, "Groups build up fantasies of each other out of scraps of information, hearsay, guesswork, and projected elements of their own inner life. These features are strengthened, changed, and weakened through subsequent experiences. At any moment, we may say that the fantasized relationship is waiting to become manifest through actual interaction between members of different groups. If a meeting of representatives is enthusiastic and trustful, we may infer they have in common an idea of actually trusting groups. If the meeting is wary or openly suspicious, each group probably sees itself as exposed to possible exploitation by the other. And that's what we're here to try to provide some kind of context for. So that last part, the mistrust, can be changed into trust. These encounters, the perspective suggests the meetings of societies for education may provide an antidote to the mistrust among institutes about who is and who is not maintaining good training practices for psychoanalytic education. These encounters provide an experience of the other groups that is much more complex and more personal than is usually the case within a large group such as the IPA. They are neither designed so that one group will be persuaded by the other that their training model is flawed or inadequately meets standards, nor are they designed to simply affirm that what one is doing is correct or the best or the only way to educate analysts. Representatives to these intergroup events tend to idealize their home group, and this has dangers for encounters, as it is essential to both show what they are proud of and also be open to reflecting and potentially questioning what have been customary ways of thinking. To join in the encounter, that is to become a member of the new group formed to study education, requires the participants to hold a flexible attitude which allows new ideas to penetrate while maintaining the affiliation with the home group. And if the process is successful, it can lead to enhanced appreciation of differences and increased sense of belonging to a larger group that has more in common than it is different. This message, learn through experience, I say that again, learn through experience, not through the corridor conversations, not through what people have heard, not through reading, but through experience, can be brought back to the home organization with the hope for effect of changing mistrust into trust across societies and regions and different models. Now I'll just say a few words about the in-person New York City meeting. At the in-person New York City meeting, 3 North American societies were chosen as they represented different ways of organizing important elements of psychoanalytic training. Roughly, a more traditional institute, a more progressive institute, and one in between. I kind of wonder if the societies that we labeled that way would label themselves that way, but anyway, that's how we thought about it. Each society introduced itself in terms of history, training philosophy, orientation, and some important policies and procedures. And this very introduction generated productive interchange among participants and considerable enthusiasm about learning different ways of dealing with educational challenges. Each society was able to advocate for itself and be recognized by others, which yielded a serious, active, and yet relaxed atmosphere, which was essential for the good outcomes achieved. The structuring, facilitating, and direction of the PEC members helped contain initial anxieties around differences. Less formal interchanges then focused around elements of training, including the governance structure, and with it, organization of power relations within each institute. As you might imagine, this proved to be a differentiating factor, especially regarding the TA system, which had significant differences between a traditional model and a more contemporary power-sharing approach. The value of the intergroup encounter was highlighted by the exchanges that took place around this usually highly contentious topic. There was conflict, there was differences, but it wasn't, I wouldn't call it contentious in the usual sense of the word. Each institute had an expressed rationale for their system, but with discussion and trust created, it was apparent that there were unconscious or systems issues beyond the stated training regulation that had led each institute to their choice in TA policies. This was quite instructive to all participants, and interestingly, at least from my perspective, most of the candidate representatives had not heard the history that contributed to the policy positions of their own institutes. Members began to think more deeply about the advantages and limitations of their own system, just what we had hoped might be accomplished. One takeaway from these encounters is how similar all institutes are in terms of how the society's history, especially but not limited to institutional trauma, has an effect on the structure and organizational climate of the institute and its training philosophy. What is sadly true from this initial experiences is that no institute is immune to the vagaries of the unconscious expression of the forbidden, and the best one can do is to be alert to the dangers and to deal with them openly when that's possible, so that transgenerational transmission of the trauma is lessened by avoiding the splitting of those circumstances that can be harmful to both institutional life and training. We all know too well what goes on in institutes when those differences and those issues cannot be discussed. Sharing such experiences provided an opportunity for self-reflection for each institute, and we hope lessons projection of unwanted aspects onto other institutes. Another similarity is the pride and sense of purpose each society has with its program and how dedicated each institute is to educating students and carrying on the psychoanalytic movement. While implemented in different ways, the strength of the emotional, financial, and time commitments of these leaders are quite similar, and this too strengthened connection among members of this work group. One important conclusion that was shared is that the ideal is really not about being better, quote, standard keepers, unquote, but to be good containers, as Angelica mentioned, for the self-reflection of candidates, faculty, and administrating, and really promoting that self-reflection. Candidates were invited, and they were especially useful, I thought, to have candidates present at this meeting, and it's something we all should keep in mind. Candidates were invited to give their perspective on these institutes. Of course, everyone was, but we had our ears wide open when they were speaking. And they reported satisfaction with their training, and to some extent were happy not to be entangled by the power and policy issues that they learned about. That is, in this intergroup event, the candidates were most identified with their own training program and with other candidates. And many issues, well, welcomed intellectually, did not resonate with them as much as they did with the faculty and leader groups. They took the lead, however, in making suggestions for innovative curriculum development and outreach, that is to say, new ideas, rather than looking at what's going on with the old ones. By creating a work group with clear boundaries, active facilitation, and explicit work task, the goals of positive exchanges among differing institutes were accomplished, or was accomplished. We learned that societies are eager to exchange perspectives and to learn from each other, and are not prone to judgment, but rather to be curious and open about what works and what doesn't, and why, what doesn't and why. And that includes historical factors rather than simply educational philosophy. What is unknown and may need attention is the follow-up, to see if these ideas made it from the positive work group with its own sentient life back to the home institute to inform others and work to lessen the distortions that can accompany unexperienced views of others. That is, to be the representative of the work group back to the home group. This may require additional outreach or perhaps larger experiences at international conferences to realize the goal of the meeting of societies. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Richard, very much for your clear and I would say enthusiastic statement about the small group methodology to enhance our experience and our knowledge about training processes. Thank you very much. Well, I don't know if now and before passing to the questions of the attendees, you three panelists want to make some exchange among you, some comments or questions.
Well, one thought I had as I was reading this and thinking about it and hearing my colleagues was, the difference between an in-person encounter and a virtual encounter, and to see maybe in our discussion and thinking about it, if it's possible to do it virtually or not. And I think my own, sort of on really, maybe it's a little bit biased, but view is that in-person encounters work better from this group dynamics perspective. And it is the availability of the in-person meeting that we'll have to see if it's required, because it becomes more than an information exchange, because information is, but I'm open to, like, I'm advocate for everyone in these things to be open to different perspectives, but that's my initial take on it.
Thank you. Angelica?
Yes.
When I was hearing the presentation of Richard, referring what had happened in the New York meeting, which was in presence meeting, and comparing it and the conclusions of that meeting and comparing them with what I could see with Ana Rosa in the meeting of FIPAL, which was online, distance meeting, I was thinking that there were a lot of issues that were very similar, but the climate had a difference, and the possibility of communication and of a friendly contact that you can get in personal meetings like this is different. I know quite well that we are wondering, and that was one of the items that emerged in the in the meeting, what will happen after the COVID? What beyond the principle of COVID, we could say, if the organizations will remain the same, the treatments will remain the same, and that there are a lot of answers we don't have it yet. But I think that for this kind, we can do it online, but it is better in presence.
Yes, I would just say something to the group dynamics, because you know, I'm always astonished that in psychoanalytic institutions we all work a lot in groups, and the group setting is seldomly reflected. It's used but not reflected. Even in my association, we have the final graduation in a group setting, and there are many group dynamics which can interfere, but it's rarely reflected. So I was interesting what Richard took up, that you know, we have 4 or 5 persons represent a subgroup of their institute, and what will happen when they come back. I was just thinking, being a child analyst, you know, when you work with a child, you work with the parents, as we do it in Germany. And it's very interesting how working with one person of a system, it influences the system. It's not for sure, but it can have an influence. And I think what Richard said at the end, the follow-up is very important. You know, what will happen when the participating members of the societies come back? So we just recently, I developed the idea that we will have a follow-up. You know, we have a meeting. Unfortunately, it will be online via Zoom in December with EPF, with 6 EPF societies. And so I thought we will invite the same society next March for the EPF conference in Nice, and we will see how it works. So we could enlarge this, and I hope we can do it, but if not, we will do another online meeting via Zoom. I personally think it's the best we can do now, but it's very, very difficult, because what is so important with these group meetings is the atmosphere, the climate, which is often beyond words. And so it is with psychoanalytic training. I think the quality of training, it's not the didactic only, it has a very important developmental aspect. You can't teach a candidate to become an analyst. You can't teach it, but you can help them becoming it. It was Ogden and Gabbard stressed in her article.
Well,
Angelica told us about 2 steps in the work during this kind of meetings. The first step in preparing the meeting and what each participant is going to say. It gets him reflecting to his own profile and the profile of his institution. The second is the discussing in a horizontal way during the meeting. Perhaps we could add a third step that includes a later reflection when the participants go back to their homes, to their societies, and what can they do, and this, if it is useful or not, and what happens, what has happened during the meeting.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure some of you have been to Tavistock group relations conferences. That is, I mentioned that there's a small group experience, a large group experience, and the intergroup experience. My memory, which is a little bit foggy from the time, it's been a while since I did it, but the small group was very intense and very personal, and the large group was very kind of crazy, and because the dynamics are different, and the intergroup was like a different kind of experience. It was kind of chaotic because people would be sent out all over the place to represent their group without any attention to what authority was given to those representatives to go out, and they'd come back, and it'd be astounding when you reflected on it. When you were experiencing it, you just thought, oh well, isn't this fun? We'll just send everybody out and we'll give them absolute authority. Like, you would never want to do that in a real organization or an intergroup event. What we ask in these intergroup events is for people to do that, is to come with their home identifications and then form as a group and then go back and influence, because of their experience with the formed group, their old group. But what authority do they have to do that? Have they been authorized to do that? Will they be listened to? How can we create that interchange afterwards? I think what Angelicas is saying is, and this is being piloted because we're trying to find our way. So we're learning a lot as we do it.
Well, I think now it's time to pass on to the second part of our webinar to give a space to the questions of the attendees. We received many questions, interesting, but obviously we won't be able to cover all of them. I begin by the following question, because there are several referred to the comparison with the previous oversight committee, and it might be very interesting that you might answer from the current point of view. So let me a second. Oh, sorry. I lost the question I had selected. I don't know why. Sorry.
Yes, I see one.
Yes, and now please, I find it. Do you think the oversight function was recognized as impossible and unproductive because it was too narcissistically wounding for some members to consider that others might have greater experience, higher standards, deeper knowledge, and therefore something to teach them? And if so, was this hidden behind excuses of incommensurable differences between models? What do you think?
I don't know if I quite I didn't understand it. So it's meant that the oversight function was difficult or abandoned because it was too narcissistically wounding for some societies, that there are other societies who are much more experienced and better. Was this the sense?
Yeah. That's exactly the sense, yes.
Yeah, but that's exactly what we are taking up and we want to change, because that is a very narcissistic view that there is one way how it's the best. You are the only one who do the right Eitingen model, and the other one is doing it less good. So I think our way is to do it on a horizontal level. And the oversight function was created for the education committee after the recognition of the three models. It was not before. before it was before was no education committee with oversight function, and it was created about an anxiety that now there will be an anything go, and people will do hybrid models and take from this model something and from the other. So there was created this oversight functions, and I was in the committee later at this time. We never did use this oversight function. In reality, it was just a paper tiger.
Well, Alfredo, Richard, you want to add something?
I mean, I think it's a. I was in the APSA. There was a committee called the Committee on Institutes, which would go and do oversight function in what were called site visits. So you'd go and review people's training philosophies and meet in person and talk to candidates and teachers and administrators. And you know, the experience was quite positive, I think. Mostly people were very open to learning from a third. In fact, we're kind of happy to learn from a third. Of course, there were some defenses because some things were not going right. But I didn't get this sense from the ones I went to and the ones I heard about that the visiting team was unwelcome, because they did provide not a better way, but the same kind of containing, reflective space to think about themselves. It was much more that than let me tell you what we know from that I know better than you. And of course, that when one's a member of an oversight site visit, one should remain humble, because you have to only think back to your home institute to remember all the problems the home institute has, and that we have something to share, but mostly to share a process rather than, you know, sort of top-down advice. I think if we could afford those kind of visits in the IPA, it would be a good idea. I don't think we either can afford it or that they'd be as welcome, and they're not. Since APSA ended that committee, it's only on occasion when there's particular troubles that a consultation an in-person consultation is used. So I guess I disagree with the idea that it was, you know, people are afraid to be found out. They're more welcome, you know, help. And I think that's what we experienced in these in-person meetings as well.
I would say, oh yeah, okay.
Yes, Angelica, please.
I agree with Richard, but it has to. That was on an the American societies level, but on an international level, we have this is mostly done by the committee by ING, you know, with new groups, and they do site visits, and that's very, very helpful. But you have to find out a methodology, and that is what we do. And site visits are very useful if they are asked for, or if there's really a problem. That's what we still do and can do, but not that we have to control if the models are really done in the best way as it is on paper.
Perhaps I could say that I believe that not everything that was included in the oversight necessarily has to be blocked and or it is absolutely negative. Perhaps in the ways we are speaking of begging for a better kind of interaction within the societies and between the societies is more in accord with the kind of way of thinking in psychoanalysis, with more free of thought.
Okay, so can we pass to the next question? It says, I have one remark and one question. The remark is because I was observer in New York meeting of societies. It is the importance for the candidates to know the history of the society. The question is to ask Angelica to develop the idea of external and inner authority. Marie-Francis Paul.
I mean, when do you want me to answer?
Yeah. Yes, please.
Yes,
just begin.
Yes. I mean, I think the relation between external and internal authority is very important, because we all have to have some external authority we have to obey, and it influences our internal authority. And as analysts, we mostly think of the superego, but the superego has become an inner authority through internalization. And it's not so much interested in supporting autonomy of the human being. And I wanted to draw the attention to an inner authority of a different kind. And I find the concept of subject very helpful, which was developed in French psychoanalysis about subjectivation. And that's an ongoing process of becoming a subject of one's own thoughts and feelings, body and history. And I think that is very important in appropriating one's own life and taking responsibility for the person one is. And one has always to do this in relation to others. One has to see oneself from another perspective in order to become a subject. That's something what Alfredo elaborated with self-reflection too. And I think then this means that one wants to be actively understand how others see the world, and that one is part of a social organization. So for me, that is a very different aspect than the external authority, which is internalized. And that's what I meant when I say in psychoanalytic training, candidates have to learn how to use concepts, and they have to learn some competencies. But there is a developmental process which we have to foster by a climate in the institute, by an open thinking, and that is helping them becoming a psychoanalyst. And I think we have to offer that. And so that's why I think the distinction is very important. And I think the IPA should be more somebody who enhances inner authority, but nevertheless, you have to follow the standards and the rules.
Yeah, I thought your comment in your paper, Angelica, that what is it? Why do we even have an association? Why do we associate? We associate, International Psychoanalytic Association is because there are benefits to being associated.
Yeah.
That and many, many benefits, including this webinar, of course. And there are limitations when you join. You can't just pick and choose which elements you want to keep and which ones you would rather you're free to join others with. And so that tension about autonomy and association, which is of course present in all groups and all organizations, it's no shock we have conflicts about how much or where or when or how we're willing to sacrifice, a local institute is willing to sacrifice its autonomy to remain in association with other psychoanalysts. So that's the tension, and it's like Alfredo says, it's a positive tension. It's yes. A creative tension. It doesn't have to be a destructive tension.
Let's go on to the next. One of the most debated controversies is the question if the psychoanalytic education should change Should changes in society be taken in account? In the Berlin meeting on 100 years of education, I learned that we need a time-related diagnosis of our societies. What do the panelists think is characteristic of our time? How should training adapt to it? I repeat the end. What do the panelists think is characteristic of our time? How should training adapt to it?
That is a very good question.
Very good, very important.
Yes.
I should like to answer just a minimum of that question, because I think that that question is so broad that we would need a Congress, not a webinar, to answer it. What happens, what is changing in our times? But I should like to take just 2 points. One is that this is the time of fast food, and this is the time of low cost. These are two prototypes of commercial communication, traveling, and psychoanalysis is not a fast food treatment, and it's difficult also to be a low-cost treatment. But does it mean that the psychoanalysis has to be outside the new world? I think that no. But we need to be alert, to be aware of what is happening around us. And we know that we have to change some aspects, but to be aware in not running for that changes, but living it slowly. It's a tension between change and remaining just the same, of course, that it happens also in the organizations. And I think that also has to be with the contrast between vertical organizations and horizontal organizations, and to get a mix of them.
Well, I would add that that's closed organizations die. If your boundaries are too firm and you don't allow new inputs into your organization, the organization will die. It is what is allowed in and how does it affect the organization and what changes can be there. So the integrity and identity of the organization remains, but new elements are added. That's just a different way of saying what Alfredo said. You know, in our own, perhaps some of you internationally, of course, people in the United States are closely following our election. And it is such a contrast between a wish for the old, a return to the old, and an opportunity for new. And with the new comes lots of anxiety. And returning to the old also has, or maintaining the old causes also lots of anxiety. Law and order, you know, law and order, as if law and order is the principle that is best, you know, the best principle to follow for some people. And I think that tension between law and order, freedom to think, creativity, and then the extension, chaos and anything goes, which is not the same as freedom, is in our organization too. And what we're trying to find is not so much a balance. I don't think balancing is my own answer anyway, but a really thoughtful way of taking in what elements can be incorporated and what should we fight to preserve. So, you know.
I think what Richard said, you put it very nicely. I only want to say that really, if psychoanalytic training wants to preserve its creative potential, its teachers should not confuse the necessary mediation of tradition with dogmatic idealization. So make a difference. and an idealization of the past. That's law and order, but can accept that in each case it has a temporarily finite nature of our understanding of psychoanalysts and teachers. But I think we have to accept that in a way psychoanalysis in our time, it's in a way it's anachronistic. It takes time and it's not at low cost, and I think we have to preserve this but be open to critical interventions, to new elements. And I think that's the best thing we can do, but it's very, very difficult. And I think this interaction between different regions, between different societies can be very helpful to learn what is new for the others, what they think, what we think. I can't put it in so good words, but maybe it's clear what I mean.
Here is a contribution about one question you have posed about online groups. Here, Anna Rosa Trachtenberg says, the horizontal dialogue in online way is different from in-person way, but it is possible. The climate is more difficult to be achieved online. It's very polite.
I think that we all agree with Ana Rosa because it happens something similar with the psychoanalytic treatment. At the beginning, many people thought that we couldn't do it online, that it wasn't possible. What was going to happen with our patients, with our work, with the psychoanalytic education? And this year with the pandemic, we have been recruiting information for all over the world, and we have experienced it in our own treatments and societies, that it was possible to make treatments. It's not the ideal way, but we can do it, and we can continue with the analytic formation in our institutes. And there is a general coincidence about it in different societies. That's what we are collecting in the answers of the directors of training that have arrived to the committee.
I think what Ana Rosa says is important for us to, keep in mind, because polite is one. Who could argue that polite isn't a good thing? Polite is civilized, and we like civilization more or less, but not completely. But it isn't the opposite of polite. Is not impolite. I don't think that's what we're striving for, or rude. But I would say more playful interactions. That would be what I would, a play space, a creative space, transitional space, things that we know about. That's where creativity takes place, especially in a group activity. Are there ways to foster that online, enhance it? Is it required to be in person? That's how I don't have. Again, we're going to pilot this, and we're going to find out as much as we can, especially around the interchanges are useful regardless of the climate. But is the climate the essential element, or just a kind of a bonus?
I was thinking of what Richard has said about the play, and we can learn to play with the electronics and with all methods we have access, also with children and with adolescents. And they have taught us many things also about this way of interacting. They have taught.
Okay, I read another question that connected with what you are discussing. It says, having participated in the meeting last February, I found it a remarkably satisfying and illuminating experience. I do have a question about remote training at this point. Do you feel that falls under this committee purview? And would you also say that the IPA's current mandate is to provide dialogue, but not restrictive oversight with regard to the implementation of remote analytic training? Do you want me to repeat it, or?
No, it's clear.
It's clear.
It's clear, yeah.
Well, I'm a member of the Remote Training Analyst Task Force, so I serve on both committees. And so the PEC, I would say when I'm on the PEC, I'm very glad not to have to worry as much about it as when I'm on the other committee. Then I worry a lot about exactly that question, about what kind of procedural code, what goes into the procedural code that will be relevant to today's world with the pandemic experience, while being relevant to all the concerns we've just mentioned about what needs to be preserved. So the short answer is that PEC is not, at least Angelica can correct me if I'm wrong, isn't really focused on analyzing or thinking about remote analysis, except when it comes to our attention that there's been a problem in a society, and that this other task force is being authorized to really study and come up with recommendations for a new procedural code. But that's going to take some time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, can you provide oversight for this? Has oversight been provided? Maybe that's the question. It's not that we don't know, sort of anecdotally, some things have been going on around the world. Has there been people overseeing what's been going on? Not particularly, I would say.
I mean, we had in the last 7-8 years, since I have been on the education committee, we had societies questioning if they could implement a distant training or remote analysis for training, and we discussed this on a single case basis, and it was always about exceptional circumstances, you know, and but it was not a general rule, and so we still do that, but the task force is working out a general solution or recommendation for the executive committee and the board.
Okay. So we are coming to then the last question for all panelists. Does your experience provide you with ideas about common aspects of education within local institutes and centers that are most difficult to apply organizational self-reflection?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, Ines?
Yeah.
Yes. Does your experience provide you with ideas about common aspects of education within local institutes that are most difficult to apply organizational self-reflection?
I mean, we have these cases, and there are institutes. I can't go into details where you get very hopeless because you consult, you argument, but they do what they want, you know. But that is then a case for the sometimes for the ethical committee, and we do give an recommendation, and then we have to give it to the executive board or to the executive committee or to the IPA board. We can only do a consultation, but we had those cases. But these societies we had up to now, we didn't have it in our meeting societies on education, but it's just a pilot project. We just started it.
I think it would be no surprise to say issues of power and authority are the most difficult to reflect on. They're not impossible, but they're the most difficult to reflect on who's in charge, who determines for each society what the policy is, what's the power relationship between those that are charged with the training and those receiving the training and those in between, those charged with forming the rules. And that's always been in the form of a TA system, has been the most concrete expression of that, but it's not limited to that. I think issues of power and authority, because people in power and authority think they're doing the right thing, and you know, and other people don't like being told what to do. That's sort of Angelica's point for at a societal level. So I mean, I think it's not impossible, but I think that's certainly one of the sticking points.
Mm.
I would say that exactly as Angelica and Richard, institutional narcissism is one of the main difficulties to afford with this kind of works. But I would also, not to speak only of this, I would also catch one of the results of we have been working, that is the answers the effect of those kind of communications after the meetings. I mean the later reflection stimulated by the meeting, and we are beginning to receive some letters. I have one, but this is not the moment to read it, with what had the meeting created in the mind of one candidate who was with us in one of that experiences.
Well, our webinar has come to an end. We are on time. Thank you very much for your interesting contributions, both from the panelists and the attendees that has made this webinar a lively and open discussion. Thank you very much. I want to say that our next webinar will take place on November 13. At that time, the subject will be, what is the IPA today? The panelists will be our president, Dr. Virginia Ungar, our vice president, Sergio Nick, and the moderator, Heribert Blas. Well, we hope you'll join us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ines, for your moderating.
Thank you. Thank you for moderating, and thank you.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks to the webinar team.
Thank you, everybody.